Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where today we've got Dr. Robert Blumofe, EVP and CTO of Akamai Technologies. And he's going to join me on the podcast today to share his story. And for those of you that don't know, Akamai is a cloud company that is helping companies build, deliver and secure their digital experiences. And the company also has an incredible 8,000 employees worldwide. And in 2021, they generated $3.5 billion globally. Not to mention the fact that more than 50% of the Fortune 500 use Akamai's products and services. And its customers include some pretty big names such as Lufthansa, Airbnb, Honda, and I could go on and on. But today, we're going to explore where the bar has been set for digital transformation at the enterprise level, and how organizations globally can keep pace with those setting that gold standard. But also explore how those lagging behind in their digital journey, how they can catch up without exposing their security infrastructure and risk, and the pivotal role that Zero Trust plays in defending against increasing cyber attacks in this new world of work. And if all that sounds exciting, you ain't seen nothing yet. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Beverly Hills, where we have not only a beautiful tech story, but a good old-fashioned Hollywood-style story too. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do, and maybe share your origin story as well and what put you on this path you're on today?
Sure. Yeah. Origin story. What a great question, and love talking about. I actually come from a show business family, believe it or not. I grew up in Beverly Hills, 90210, the whole thing. What? My dad was a producer and for quite a few years was running production at United Artists. And then for a number of years was director of the American Film Institute in Beverly Hills. And on my mom's side, my grandfather was the comedian Jack Benny. And I'm assuming for some of you all listening to this have no idea who that is. Some of you maybe recognize the name and can picture him and some of his comedy very easily. Others, as I said, probably have no idea who I'm talking about. But he was a very popular radio and television, did some movies as well. But the Jack Benny program on radio and television in the early days was on and popular continuously, really for well over 30 years, a run that I don't know if there's any other show quite like that. Maybe The Simpsons. I think The Simpsons had a run of somewhere in that neighborhood, probably still is having a run. But yeah, he was a popular American comedian. And actually my grandmother, I like to mention her as well, because even Mary Livingston, because even though she's probably best known as Jack Benny's wife, she actually was a pioneer in the early days of radio in her own right. Playing a female character who, unlike most of the other female characters on radio that day, was independent, clever, and, not submissive or dependent on a man in any way. And I think that's a pioneering type of role that laid the road forward for comedians that maybe we know in more modern times, like Mary Tyler Moore.
Wow, that is an incredible story. I always ask that question to find out more. And one of the reasons I ask as well is 9 times out of 10, nobody wanted to set out to join or begin a career in technology. There's always some kind of backstory there. And you mentioned Jack Benny there as well. Was he in It's a Mad, Mad World? I don't know why I've got that in the back of my head.
Oh my God, I can't believe you remember that. When I was in London, we were walking around and I came across the Palladium. I think that's what it is, the Palladium. And there's a wall of fame out in front there, and with a number of photos of some of the performers who were there. And there's Granddad right there on the wall of fame at the Palladium. He's got three stars on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. I could go on and on about Granddad, but moving on actually to the technology side, despite that background, I was never really thought of myself that way, show business or anything like that. I identified as a math and science nerd from very early on. And fortunately, I did have a role model in the family. I have an older half brother who's almost 10 years older than me. And so when I was in elementary school, 6th, 7th grade, say, he was already an undergraduate at Stanford studying computer science. And one summer he came back with a HP calculator, a Hewlett Packard calculator that was programmable, and he showed it to me. He sort of explained the basics to me, and I was smitten. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and so he let me use it, and I taught myself the assembly language that you use to program the thing, and I would just for fun, which sounds silly that this would be fun, but it was to me. I would just for fun write little programs on his calculator, and that was my introduction to computers and programming, and well, here I am.
Yeah, and it was that path that would lead you to Akamai Technologies. So for people, there'll be a lot of people that know exactly all about you guys, and others will be learning about you for the first time. So can you set the scene and just tell me more about the problems that you solve with technology?
Well, yeah. And, the path to Akamai, actually starts with my experience at MIT. In the early 90s, I was a PhD student at the MIT Lab for Computer Science, in particular in the theory group. And my PhD advisor was Professor Charles Lyserson, who some of you all may know as one of the 4 authors of the Introduction to Algorithms textbook that's used everywhere. And I also worked very closely with Professor Tom Layton. And it was Tom who went on to found Akamai in 1998. I joined the company a little less than a year later in the summer of 1999. And I can tell you at that time, I actually didn't even know what the company did. And it didn't really factor into my decision-making about joining the company. It wasn't relevant. What mattered is I knew it was Tom's company. And I also knew a fair number of other people who were working at the company, because many of them were colleagues of mine from MIT, even some of my academic siblings from MIT. And I just knew that if I stayed close to that group of people, that good things would happen. And I'd have fun to boot, because it's a great group of people with great sense of humor. And so it really was about following the people. And, as I've gotten older and I like to pontificate and give unsolicited advice, especially to my children, I like to tell them, pay attention to the people, follow good people, surround yourself with good people you enjoy being around, and ideally people who make you laugh too. Back then, now I know what Akamai does, and yeah. I learned that pretty quickly. We started off in content delivery, and we really pioneered what's today called content delivery. And we still have a significant business in content delivery, and that's all about scaling and accelerating the delivery of media. Today, that would most often be, for example, watching movies online. Now you can watch very high quality, high def movies online with no rebuffering. You get a great experience, and that's through these technologies that we delivered that we call content delivery. And that was really where the company started. Now we also have a very large business in cybersecurity that started about 10 years ago. And, that's now more than $1 billion annually for us and growing rapidly. So that's another big piece of our business. And with the Linode acquisition, most recently, we now also have a significant business in cloud computing. And so we like to say that we're now the world's most distributed cloud platform with leading solutions in delivery, in security, and in computing. And we take pride now in operating at a scale where we can credibly say that we, as a tagline, that we now make life better for billions of people, billions of times a day.
And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was to dive a little bit deeper into that well-known topic of digital transformation, right? Because one of the big switches I've seen over the last 10 years is that employees now have much more tech than their employers, and bringing those same expectations that they have in their home environment and in their everyday lives and bringing that into the office. But I'm curious, can you tell me where you believe the bar has been set for digital transformation at the enterprise level?
Yeah, I think for the entire, for the every level, digital transformation has created a level of interdependence that I think for a lot of people, they're only just coming around to realize. I like to actually, kind of for fun, like to go all the way back to a wonderful quote from Leslie Lamport, who was a pioneering computer scientist. And about 40 years ago, he wrote an email where he was talking about distributed systems, a little bit tongue in cheek and a little bit angry, actually, because of some things that were happening that were making it difficult for him to work. And I'm misquoting him a bit. I'm trying to paraphrase, and I don't remember the exact words, but he said something to the effect of that in a distributed system, or a distributed system is one where a failure on a computer you've never heard of means that you can't get your work done on your computer. So he's talking about distributed systems and talking about these interdependencies. And what I like to do then is basically modify that quote for the modern world and for the results of digital transformation, which is to say that with digital transformation, we now live in a world where an outage or a cyber attack on a company you've never heard of means that you can't fill your car with gas or buy groceries at the market or get healthcare. The point being, again, back to these interdependencies where our physical world is so completely dependent on the cyber world that the physical no longer functions without the cyber.
It's just incredible, isn't it, how we've got to this moment? But so I'm curious, how can organizations better keep pace with those setting the gold standard globally and essentially avoid getting left behind?
Yeah. There's a lot of things I think that we need to pay attention to. Among the advice that I oftentimes give is to really think about embracing cloud and services that you can consume as a service. I think back in the old days, we might have thought about procuring systems and deploying them in our own data centers and building things on-prem. Nowadays, I would say you really don't want to have any technology on-prem except for the things that actually interact with the physical world, right? You probably, you've got printers, those should be on-prem. You've got user devices like laptops and desktops. You've got actuators and sensors and things like that, things that need to interact with the physical world. And so, those things need to be physically on-prem where it makes sense for them to be. But outside of that, I'm not sure it makes sense to have anything on-prem. And pretty much everything can be consumed now as a service. And I really think that if you're building from scratch, it would just make no sense to acquire anything on-prem anymore. You'd really just do everything as a service. And I think for a lot of companies who have legacy technology on-prem, the path forward is over time to deprecate and eliminate that technology and move to consuming pretty much everything in this as a service model.
And we will have business leaders listening all over the world that feel that they're getting left behind or lagging behind in their digital journey. So how can they catch up without exposing their security infrastructures to risk? Because that is another big concern that's holding people back, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. The beauty is that even security infrastructure now can be consumed as a service. Like I said, in the old days, you would have built out your cybersecurity infrastructure by consuming on-prem devices. You'd buy appliances, security appliances, deploy them in your data center. Now, there's also a model where you can basically buy virtual appliances and basically deploy them in the cloud or in your cloud data centers. I actually think you're better off taking it one step further and actually consuming security fully as a service. Pretty much every type of modern security capability is now offered as a service, whether it's secure web gateway or zero trust access or authentication and authorization, identity management. All these things can now be consumed as a service. And I think back to the point earlier, I really think that you're much better off doing that because the companies that operate these things as a service are staying on top of the latest trends. They're keeping up with the latest patches. They are defying the relevant rules that you need in your firewalls and things like that. So security as a service, I think, is the way to go today.
And of course, traditionally, when we think about cybersecurity, businesses always trusted everything inside the corporate network, everything inside the company. But that's changing now with the importance of zero trust. So can you expand on that and the role that's playing in defending against increasing cyber attacks in this new world of work that we find ourselves in?
Right. That's a great question. And, zero trust is getting a lot of attention. And in some cases, maybe people don't fully understand what it's all about. Obviously, zero trust isn't a specific product or a specific solution. It really is more of an approach to security. And there's a number of products and capabilities that are specifically relevant to a zero trust approach. And we can talk about that. But I do believe that zero trust, the zero trust approach really is your best defense against ransomware, other types of malware, other types of cyber attacks. And so I do believe very strongly that it behooves modern enterprises to adopt a zero trust approach. I also think that, zero trust allows an enterprise to really rethink and massively simplify the enterprise architecture. And simplification is important because complexity really is the enemy of security. You want to really think about simplifying your architecture, and Zero Trust allows you to do that. And I like to say that the right mindset is to think, well, your WAN, that is your enterprise WAN, that should be the internet. Your enterprise data center, well, that should be the cloud. And your enterprise office building, well, that should be a private coffee shop with great Wi-Fi. And I use that line a lot. Your office building should be a private coffee shop with great Wi-Fi, not only to illustrate how I think employees would think about the office experience of the future, especially as we come out of the pandemic, but also how the office should be architected. And so what I mean here is that, well, a private coffee shop with great Wi-Fi simply means that the office building is architected the same way as the coffee shop is or as your home is, meaning that it really connects you with nothing more than the internet. There's no private WAN, there's no inside, there's no outside, there's no notion of a private secure network, a private corporate secure network. In fact, I've wrote recently that there's really no such thing as a secure network. Talking about a secure network is like talking about a safe pool. If there's enough water to swim in, there's enough water to drown in. And so there's no such thing as a safe pool. What we want to think about is what are the right policies and the right safeguards to put in place to make swimming in that pool as safe as possible. And I think about networks in very much the same way. So you want to think about not an inside and an outside or a secure network and an unsecure network, but rather simply about endpoints and endpoints communicating with each other. And once you adopt that approach, you can really think of all access as being effectively remote access. So back to the office building being a private coffee shop with great Wi-Fi, when you're in that office building, when you access applications, you use the same remote access mechanisms as you would if you were at home or in Starbucks. All access is remote access. And we actually do that here at Akamai. I'm in the office building right now, but as I access Akamai applications, I'm using the same Zero Trust access mechanism as I would if I was from home. And that makes a lot of sense. So I know this is a little bit of a long monologue here, but I think this is important. Sure. I really think in terms of endpoints, not in terms of the network in between, but you have endpoints, they want to communicate. And what Zero Trust then is all about is controlling and managing and inspecting and applying policy to all of that endpoint communication, whether it's north-south, meaning a user like me communicating with an application, or east-west, an application talking to another application. You want to control that communication between endpoints. So first, you got to know what the endpoints are. You need to be able to identify your endpoints. In the case of an endpoint that's being used by a user like me, you want to have some kind of strong authentication, ideally multi-factor authentication, and ideally without passwords. You also want to identify the software endpoints, meaning that you don't just use things like IP addresses and ports, but rather you identify endpoints in terms of the actual binaries, the software binaries that are trying to communicate. Once you know what the endpoints are, you can then apply policy. You can then decide, is this endpoint allowed to communicate with this other endpoint? And you should only allow the communication that's necessary. And that's a really important tenet of Zero Trust. You only allow endpoints to communicate with each other if they need to communicate with each other. And finally, once you grant that access and once you allow the two endpoints to communicate with each other, you want to go further and actually inspect their communication to make sure that there isn't some kind of attack or malware in that communication. So that really is sort of my summary of Zero Trust. It's about controlling all endpoint communication, applying policy so that endpoints can only communicate with each other if the policy explicitly allows it, and inspecting to make sure that there is nothing bad in that communication.
And I'm curious, do you think we're approaching or maybe even reached a point where things like centralized cybersecurity models that are underpinned by centralized technology stack are no longer effective against cyber threats, especially when they increasingly originate from the edge of a network? Do you think we're there yet, or we're very close to it?
Oh, we're definitely there. I like to say that, when you think about computing, as a rule of thumb, you're almost always better off moving compute to the data than the other way around, moving data to the compute. And the analog to security is that you're rather than moving your traffic to your security stack, that is backhauling your traffic over to your security stack, you're better off moving the security stack to where the traffic already is. And that means that your security stack needs to be ubiquitous. It needs to be at the edge of the internet, near where the endpoints are, whether they're application endpoints or user device endpoints or IoT endpoints. You need to have your security stack near those endpoints so that you don't have to backhaul the traffic to the security stack. Instead, the security stack is already at the edge of the internet near those endpoints. So absolutely, I think security belongs at the edge. It needs to be at the edge. It needs to be ubiquitous, not in a handful of centralized locations.
And from those conversations that you're having with enterprises all over the world, are there any trends in the kind of challenges that they're facing and they're coming to you and asking for your help with? Are there any big trends that you're helping them with right now?
Yeah, I would say, everything that I talked about with Zero Trust starts with visibility. And I would say, a lot of the conversations with customers start there. What are my endpoints? Which endpoints are trying to communicate with each other, and which ones should be allowed? Visibility, everything starts with visibility. You need to be able to see your endpoints and see what communication is being attempted before you can apply policy. And so increasingly, as we try to help our customers with these problems, and we look at our security product portfolio, increasingly we try to augment that portfolio with capabilities that allow for visibility, where you can get reports that show you, well, here are your endpoints, here's the communication that's happening today, and then from there, our customers can apply policy. But it always has to start with visibility.
And I'm curious, are those evolving demands of your customers, are they changing your focus at Akamai Technologies too? And are you having to adapt to these trends?
For sure. Yeah. I mentioned as we think about our product roadmaps and how we build our products going forward, incorporating visibility into pretty much everything we do is key. It's also, this trend is what led us to do the acquisition about a year ago, I guess now, of Guardicore. I mentioned that we want to be able to apply policy to all endpoint communication, whether it's north, south, east, west. We already had in our portfolio north-south capabilities with our Zero Trust access solutions. We didn't have anything east-west, and Guardicore, we believe, is the leading solution for east-west policy. The technology is generally referred to as microsegmentation. But another beauty of the technology, of this microsegmentation technology, is it also gives you great visibility. Once you have Guardicore agents in your environment, you get great visibility into which endpoints are trying to talk to which other endpoints. And from there, you can apply policy.
Now, we started the podcast today talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And as we come full circle, I'm now going to ask you about the fact that none of us are able to achieve success without some help along the way. So is there a particular person that you're grateful towards throughout your journey who's played a big part in helping you get where you are today?
Yeah, there's been so many. It's a great question. I really appreciate you asking it, because I think we all sort of enjoy the opportunity to recognize those people. And I've mentioned a number of them already, including my brother, my own family, my grandfather and other family members. I also talked about Professor Lyserson and Professor Layton. Professor Layton, of course, is now not only was the founder, but he's also now the CEO here at Akamai. But the person I'd really like to call out here is Professor Andy Van Dam at Brown University. I was an undergraduate there, and that's where I really started sort of formal learning about computer science. And Andy's a bit of a legend. I should probably take out the a bit part. He's a legend, especially at Brown in computer science. He founded the computer science department, and there's so many things I could say about him, but the key thing I want to call out here is he was a person who believed in me and helped me in ways that I don't think I deserve. I was, at that point in my life, I was not exactly the model of achievement. Like maybe many people at that stage in their life, I was distracted, let me say it that way, by other things. But Andy saw something in me, and he just believed in me, and he continued to give me opportunities. He allowed me to work in his research group. Even though I was an undergraduate, he's a huge believer in undergraduate research opportunities at Brown, and he allowed me to work in his research lab. He also gave me teaching assistant opportunities. Again, he I believe probably started the undergraduate teaching assistant program at Brown. He let me do that. He also, when I took a year off, he got me a job at a startup in Providence, Rhode Island called Cadre Technologies. And to this day, I consider some of those early people at Cadre as friends. And it was it was a life-changing experience for me. That was my first opportunity to work in a professional software development environment with an incredibly talented group of people. And it would be an understatement just to say that it changed my life. It really did. That experience at Cadre. That was all Andy. That was Andy giving me opportunities that it's not clear I really deserved, but he just stuck with me, believed in me. And in many ways, I think he was sort of putting his own reputation on the line, because it wasn't clear that these bets were going to pay off. In the end, I like to think it did, because, I did end up, also thanks to him, end up at MIT as a graduate student. And, here I am today. So I'd like to think he's proud of that. But boy, what a difference he made. And by the way, many others from Brown have similar stories to mine. It's probably in the hundreds, maybe more, who could tell a similar story. Andy is a true legend, and he made a huge difference for me.
Wow. From start to finish, you've had an incredible journey there and a great story. And I love how humble you are too. And although this is a daily tech podcast, I think it's so important to get the human stories behind it shared on this podcast. But before I let you go, for anyone listening wanting to find out more about the technical aspects of everything we've explored today, more about how you're helping companies and the trends that you're seeing, etc., what's the best starting point for everything?
Well, obviously the company has the website, obvious URL, Akamai.com. And, I'm on social media, both, LinkedIn and Twitter with my name, Robert Blumofe. So there's a lot of things you could find there. I've recently had an opportunity to write some things both about zero trust. And I also had some fun writing about my grandfather and trying to back to the human story. How is it that a radio and television comedian could actually impact the life and career of a nerd? And so I've had some fun trying to explain those connections in interesting ways. And if you want to laugh, look up Jack Benny online, maybe watch some YouTube clips just for fun.
Fantastic advice. I've loved chatting with you today about how business leaders that feel they are lagging behind on their digital journey can catch up without exposing their security infrastructures, and also exploring the role that zero trust will play in defending against increasing cyber attacks in the new world of work, but also for just your taking the time to sit down and share your very rich story there and to bring it all back full circle to Hollywood and Beverly Hills. Your story reminds me of the line, I think it was Clarence said in It's a Wonderful Life, and where he said, strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. And with that note, I'd just like to say a big thank you for sharing your story today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to do that.
So many big talking points there, such as why the centralised cybersecurity model that's underpinned by a centralised technology stack is, let's face it, no longer effective against cyber threats that increasingly originate from the edge of the network. But of course, many, many years from now, this will be the episode that I remember as the moment that I spoke to the grandson of Jack Benny. What a great guy. Absolutely loved chatting with him today, and I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. But please share your insights, your thoughts on anything we talked about today just by sending me a quick message. Email techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. And if you'd like to come on here, ask a question, whatever it is, keep those messages coming over. But that's it for today, so a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.